This has been and will be one of the most powerful images in the history between Latin America and the European Union. After 25 years of negotiation and after many bumps in the road, now with Javier Milei at the helm, the free trade agreement between the European Union and the South American countries included in the Mercosur is about to be finalized. In an era marked by protectionism and tariff wars, with the European Union imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese electric cars and the US pulling out of gigantic free trade agreements, this news has come as a shock. And no wonder. We're talking about a trade zone of 800 million people that represents a quarter of the planet's entire GDP. For its part, the European Union is the second largest trading partner of the Mercosur countries, behind China, but ahead of the United States. Last year alone, exports from both regions exceeded 100 billion euros. On the other hand, Mercosur exports a lot of critical minerals for the European technology sector, as well as very competitive food products. The European Union pays for this mainly with machinery and chemical products. Despite these figures, however, trade between these two regions remained anything but straightforward. Tariffs were exorbitant. Regulations could paralyze products for several weeks at customs, and there was not even a single procedure for trading with each Mercosur country. But today, that is closer than ever to changing. The latest trade agreement proposes to eliminate tariffs on 90% of products and simplify procedures to make trade between these blocs as easy as trade between European countries. However, let's not be too quick to claim victory.
We have to be very realistic. We have a long way to go.
Despite the fact that Milei has already finalized a statement with the Union in order for both parties to sign the final agreement, there are still many obstacles that could blow it up, particularly in the European Union. But to address this issue, we first need to understand what Mercosur is and why this agreement has been negotiated for 25 years without success. Then we can answer the following question. What does the 6th of December agreement mean for Europe and South America? How can Milei revolutionize the economies of both regions? In this video, I'm going to tell you about it, so let's get started. Historically, Latin American countries have followed a trade strategy known as import substitution. And what does that consist of? To allow goods to be imported to manufacture products yourself, to promote your local industry, and then to export your industry abroad. This may sound very good, but it ended up being a tremendous failure. The things that these countries produced by themselves were much more expensive, lower quality, and less efficient than those that could be bought in other countries. For what reason? Well, due to lack of experience, lack of talent, lack of complementary industries. In short, as much as Argentine politicians wanted to imitate German industry, they ended up with a version of AliExpress. The result? Their exports ended up being very uncompetitive. To solve this, they decided to change their strategy, and instead of exporting, they focused on producing for the local market. However, the local market is very easily corrupted, and came to be monopolized by 4 state-owned companies, or in the hands of businessmen connected to the petty tyrant of the day. As a result, the companies became even less efficient. Fortunately, however, things began to change in the 1990s. The 1990s was the golden age of globalization, the time when everyone was excited about how China was opening its doors and the Soviet bloc countries began to capitalize. Free trade was in vogue, and Latin America didn't want to be left out. And so, in 1991, the Southern Common Market, Mercosur, an alliance between Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, emerged. At first, it was a success. Trade between these countries grew from $10 billion to $70 billion within a couple of decades. Even so, look what happened next. Around 2012, trade went backwards with a vengeance. What was it that held back Mercosur's success? Well, despite its successes, Mercosur has always been an alliance riddled with many problems. To begin with, there's one obvious difference with the European Union: the lack of a common currency. This is very important, because in this respect, each country can manipulate its currency to affect its trade balance. In fact, this is exactly what happened in 1999. Brazil devalued its currency, striking a blow to Argentine exports. Also, Mercosur was not a true free trade zone either. Countries still had huge tariffs between them, and it was also common that, depending on how diplomatic relations were, several products got lost in customs. You can probably imagine. To top it all off, starting in 2000, when things seemed to be getting better, politicians like Nestor Kirchner and Lula da Silva turned Mercosur into an alliance more political than economic. In fact, starting in the following decade, Bolivia and Venezuela joined the club, although Venezuela was expelled in 2017. If anyone expected Mercosur to be something like the European Union of South America, nothing could be further from the truth. Now, what if I told you that these were not even Mercosur's main problems? Yes, tariffs were high, trade was hyper-regulated, and most decisions were more political than economic, but there are worse issues. Mercosur was conceived from the outset as closed regionalism. In other words, Latin American countries joined the wave of free trade, yes, but only among themselves. For the rest of the countries, tariffs remained the same, or even increased. For example, while the global average tariff is 5%, and the US and Europe usually have tariffs of 3 or 3.5%, Mercosur has tariffs of between 13 and 15%. In other words, a true outrage that explains why the agreement with the European Union has been in the bottom drawer for 25 years. But there's more. Countries that join Mercosur lose sovereignty over their trade policy. This means that a member country, such as Argentina, cannot sign a free trade agreement without the permission of the bloc. Precisely for this reason, presidents such as Uruguay's Lacalle Pou have been very critical of Mercosur, so much so that until a few years ago it was not at all clear that this organization would survive. Javier Milei, in fact, advocated leaving Mercosur before becoming president. But of course, life takes many turns. And these days, Milei is not only the president of Argentina, but also of Mercosur itself. And for now, it doesn't appear that he wants to break it, but rather to end this closed regionalism once and for all.
Durante los últimos 20 años nos hemos perdido la oportunidad de nuestras vidas. Fuimos a contramano del mundo durante el ciclo de mayor integración comercial de la historia global, que redundó en el mayor desarrollo de países emergentes jamás visto. Mientras el resto del planeta se expandía gracias al comercio, nosotros le dijimos que no a Estados Unidos, que ofrecía un acuerdo de libre comercio en todo el continente. Pero esa perorata disfrazada de nacionalismo le costó carísimo a nuestros ciudadanos. ¿Saben cuál es la única manera de defender el interés de nuestras naciones? Promoviendo el libre comercio, porque el libre comercio genera prosperidad.
After almost a decade of being put on hold due to the socialist wave that flooded Latin America, in 2019, the EU and Mercosur sat down once again to negotiate. But at the end of the day, it didn't last long, and the project stopped at that moment. Just before leaving the Casa Rosada, Alberto Fernandez voted in favor of continuing to stall the agreement. But now both Milei and Lula seem more willing than ever to resolve this story. And now that you all know the background, I'm sure you have a question. Okay, but what does the pre-agreement with the EU consist of? What exactly has been signed? The most significant point is that Mercosur will withdraw most of the tariffs it imposes on European products. We're talking about eliminating tariffs on key industries for Europe, such as the automotive industry, which, for example, previously had a 35% tax. The 20% tariff on chemical products will also be eliminated, and we'll even say goodbye to tariffs on food products, such as wine and canned peaches, which, for some reason, had a 55% tariff. In total, it's estimated that Europe will save 4 billion euros each year in tariffs, although in truth it will be European consumers who will save all this money through cheaper products at the supermarket. The idea is to make trade much more fluid. Fewer papers need to be signed. Fewer permits are required, and very importantly, the procedure will be the same for all Mercosur countries. This may seem like a small detail, a trifle, but not at all. These types of procedures are essential, especially when trading with countries that are not exactly known for their efficient and transparent bureaucracy. However, not everything is as rosy as it might seem. There are 2 points that could become a real headache for both European and Latin American consumers. On the one hand, the European Union has non-negotiable quality standards, and we aren't only talking about phytosanitary quality, but also everything you can imagine. Labor, egalitarian, climatic. In short, the typical European Union quality. And what does this mean exactly? Well, the EU is going to require Mercosur to ensure that all products exported to Europe are eco-friendly, that they have been harvested by an equal number of men and women, all earning a living wage, and even better if they have gone to work by bicycle instead of by car. Joking aside, Europe is very insistent that this agreement has a fundamental social aspect, and has even made it conditional on Mercosur joining the Paris Agreement and meeting the targets of net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2035. Targets that, by the way, even the EU itself is far from meeting. But that's another story. But why is the trade agreement, which in principle is only economic, so strict on issues such as these? Well, that's what happens when the agreement is reviewed by more than 480 different organizations, including unions, business organizations, think tanks, environmental groups, animal rights groups, and even religious organizations. The result: costs Costs and more costs for Latin American exporters. But guess what? This isn't even the worst aspect of the deal.
The EU will grant very limited access to its market to imports of agri-food products. For sensitive products like beef, poultry, and sugar, in particular, access to the EU market will be permanently limited through gradually implemented quotas. Moreover, a bilateral safeguard clause can be applied in case increased imports from Mercosur cause, or even only threaten to cause, serious injury to the relevant EU sectors.
There is a special clause that allows trade to be halted if Mercosur causes or threatens to cause damage to the European primary sector. So if those of you in Europe were hoping that after this agreement your shopping cart would be half the price, you'd better forget it. But perhaps we should give some examples. Regarding beef, the EU will let in 99,000 tons with a 7.5% tariff. The rest will have a much higher tariff. And you may be wondering, is 99,000 tons too much or too little? Well, it represents barely 1.6% of European production, 0.7% of Mercosur's, and less than half of what Mercosur already exports to Europe right now. In fact, Paraguay alone produces 50 times more beef than is allowed to be exported to Europe with a reduced tariff. Because yes, the European Union does want Mercosur to eliminate its tariffs on European machines and vehicles. But to let Mercosur's major exports reach Europe? Are you crazy? European bureaucrats are very clear that Latin American cattle are deforesting the Amazon, and this is not an isolated case. The same applies to other products such as ethanol and sugar. With regard to sugar, for instance, the new tariff-free quotas that have been agreed barely reach 1.2% of European consumption. So for things like this, it's estimated that the impact of the free trade agreement on European GDP will be practically nil. Estimates vary widely from one method to another, but in general, no one believes that European GDP will increase by even 0.1 percentage points. Things are looking better for Mercosur, but not much better. An analysis by the Bank of Spain, for instance, estimates a growth of 0.4 points. Note that this is over the entire life of the treaty, not that growth will increase by 0.4 points each year. And do you know the most disappointing thing of all? That even with so many restrictions, the agreement is still far from being signed. On the Mercosur side, the agreement still has to be ratified by each parliament. However, if one country refuses, the rest of the countries can continue without it. But this is not the case in the European Union. Currently, the signed agreement has to be ratified in the European Council, with a minimum of 65% of the votes weighted by the population of each country. But if this goes ahead, most articles will still have to pass through the European Parliament, and there are still other articles that would have to be ratified unanimously in the national parliaments of each member state. And at this point, we must talk about the jewel in the crown, France.
France won't sign EU-Mercosur agreement, confirms Emmanuel Macron. Macron said the agreement would harm Argentina's reindustrialization and France's agriculture.
Remember all that stuff about the Paris Agreement, Amazon deforestation, and vegan eggs? Well, let's be honest. Everyone knows that it's all an excuse so that local farmers and ranchers don't have to compete with those of Mercosur. Nobody is fooled here. They've gone so far as to say that Mercosur meat does not even meet European sanitary standards. And let me ask you, when a French tourist goes on vacation to Argentina, do you think he or she says no to a barbecue for fear of getting food poisoning? Well, obviously not. But France is not the only country already opposed. Emmanuel Macron has been joined by Austria and Poland, which is Europe's largest poultry producer. In fact, the Polish agricultural lobby is so strong that Poland even voted against further lifting regulations for Ukraine to export its agricultural products to Europe, which is one of Ukraine's main sources of income in its war against Putin. Italy is also not very happy with this agreement, although it has not yet officially expressed its rejection. But all in all, if Italy joins this group, the agreement with Mercosur would not even pass the first round of ratification in the European Union. In conclusion, it will be very, very difficult for a free trade agreement with Mercosur to come to fruition. But even if it did, the benefits would not be that great, especially for Europe. At the rate things are going, we will see Mercosur allow its member states to reach bilateral agreements with other countries, such as the US or China, sooner. To end on a positive note, at least things are looking better than they did a few years ago, when negotiations were completely frozen. Mind you, it wouldn't be the first time this deal has been dusted off for 5 minutes, only to go back to spending years locked up again. But having come this far, now it's your turn. Did you know what a disappointment Mercosur has been? What do you think of the agreement with Europe? When do you think we will finally see this agreement enter into force? You can leave me your answers down in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on Visual Economic, we release new videos every single week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. And if you like the video, go ahead and like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.